Imagine spending 17 years building a company's reputation, sacrificing weekends, solving impossible problems, and earning the trust of every major client, only to watch a new executive take credit for everything you've accomplished. That's exactly what happened to me. During one board meeting, I realized my work was being presented as someone else's achievement. A few weeks later, I was called into HR and told my position no longer existed. They thought they had erased my career. What they didn't realize was that your title can be taken away overnight, but your reputation can't. And over the next few months, the truth started catching up with everyone involved. This report wasn't written by the operations department. The words came from our new chief operating officer less than 30 seconds after I finished presenting 6 months of work to the executive board. Every conversation in the room stopped. 24 people turned toward me. The projector was still displaying my team's performance dashboard, but suddenly none of the numbers mattered anymore. Melissa Carter folded her hands calmly on the conference table. The strategy was developed by corporate transformation, she continued. Daniel's team was responsible for execution only. I stood there holding the presentation remote, wondering whether I had just heard her correctly. Execution only? My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm 45 years old, and I've spent the last 17 years building one of the most efficient logistics operations in the Midwest. I've managed labor shortages, supply chain disruptions, fuel crises, and warehouse expansions. I've worked weekends, holidays, and more overnight shifts than I care to remember. But nothing prepared me for watching someone rewrite my career while I was standing in the same room. Richard Evans, our CEO, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The board members simply nodded as if Melissa's version of events had always been true. Let's move on, Richard finally said. The results speak for themselves. They certainly did. Shipping delays had dropped by 32%. Inventory accuracy had climbed above 98%. Customer complaints were at their lowest level in company history. Those weren't lucky numbers. My team had spent 14 months earning every single percentage point. Yet somehow the credit had already been reassigned. I finished the presentation because that's what professionals do. Then I walked back to my office without saying a word. I had absolutely no idea that this meeting was only the beginning. 17 years earlier, Horizon Distribution had been a completely different company. We had only 3 warehouses back then. I joined as an operations supervisor after leaving the Army, where I'd spent 12 years managing logistics units. The transition wasn't easy. Military discipline doesn't always fit corporate culture. But logistics is logistics. Whether you're delivering equipment overseas or consumer products across 5 states, success depends on planning, consistency, and accountability. Within 4 years I became Regional Operations Manager. 5 years later I was promoted to Director of Operations. Unlike many executives, I still spent at least 2 days every week walking warehouse floors instead of sitting in conference rooms. I knew employees by name. I knew which loading docks constantly caused delays. I knew which forklift drivers could solve problems before anyone asked. Most importantly, I believed that the people doing the work deserved recognition for doing it well. That philosophy earned loyalty. It also produced results. By the time I turned 45, our region consistently ranked first in every internal performance review. Not because we had the biggest budget, because we had the strongest team. Then everything changed. Our longtime CEO retired after nearly 20 years. The board hired Richard Evans from outside the company. Richard wasn't a bad leader. He simply relied heavily on consultants and executives with impressive resumes. 6 months later he introduced Melissa Carter. She specializes in organizational transformation, he told everyone during the company meeting. Melissa had worked for several Fortune 500 companies. Her presentations were polished. She spoke confidently. She knew exactly how to impress board members. Within her first month, she launched 3 initiatives with names like Future Operations, Performance Excellence, and Vision 2030. Employees joked that every project came with a logo before it came with a plan. First I ignored it. Companies change. New executives always want to make their mark. I focused on running my department. Unfortunately, Melissa focused on something else. Visibility. The first warning sign seemed harmless. One afternoon she asked to review our warehouse optimization program. I welcomed the opportunity. My team had spent nearly a year building new forecasting models that reduced unnecessary inventory transfers. We walked through every report, every metric, every implementation schedule. She asked intelligent questions and took detailed notes. "I'd like copies of everything," she said before leaving. No problem. I assumed she wanted to understand how the operation worked. Looking back, I should have been more careful. Over the following weeks, she requested more documentation, process maps, cost analyses, employee training materials, presentation slides, performance summaries. Nothing unusual by itself. Executives ask for information all the time. My mistake wasn't sharing the documents. My mistake was assuming we shared the same objective. I wanted to improve operations. Melissa wanted ownership of the improvements. My operations manager, Emma Collins, noticed the pattern before I did. "You've had 3 meetings canceled this week," she said one Friday afternoon. "I know." And Melissa attended all 3 instead. Probably scheduling issues. Emma didn't look convinced. "Daniel, have you noticed she keeps asking the same questions you already answered?" I shrugged. "Maybe she's still learning." Emma crossed her arms. "Or maybe she's preparing to explain your work without needing you in the room." I laughed. "That's a little cynical." "I hope I'm wrong." So did I. Emma had worked with me for almost 9 years. She wasn't someone who jumped to conclusions. If she felt something was off, I probably should have listened more carefully. Instead, I convinced myself that professionalism would eventually speak louder than office politics. It was a comforting belief. It also turned out to be completely wrong. 3 weeks later, an invitation appeared on my calendar. Executive Strategy Review. Attendance required. That meeting would change everything I thought I knew about loyalty, leadership, and how quickly years of hard work could disappear if the wrong people decided to tell a different story. The Executive Strategy Review was scheduled for Thursday morning. Unlike our normal operational meetings, this one included board members, outside consultants, and department heads from every division. There were nearly 30 people in the room. When I arrived, Melissa was already talking with Richard near the projector. She looked completely relaxed, like someone who already knew how the meeting was going to end. "Morning, Daniel," Richard said. "You'll be presenting the warehouse transformation results. Looking forward to it." Melissa smiled. "I'm sure everyone will be impressed." Something about the way she said it bothered me. I couldn't explain why. Not yet. My presentation lasted about 25 minutes. I walked everyone through the problems we'd faced 18 months earlier. Long loading times, poor inventory forecasting, inconsistent staffing, customer complaints. Then I explained how my team redesigned the scheduling system, rebuilt inventory planning, and standardized warehouse procedures across 4 facilities. The improvements weren't dramatic because of one big idea. They came from hundreds of small decisions made every single day. I ended with the numbers. Operating costs reduced by 26%. Overtime expenses down 34%. On-time deliveries above 97%. For a few seconds, the room was silent. Then several board members began applauding. One of them leaned forward. "Excellent work, Daniel." "Thank you." Before I could sit down, Melissa stood up. "If I may add some context." Richard nodded. "Go ahead." She walked toward the screen. "The operational improvements Daniel described are certainly impressive." I noticed she carefully avoided saying our improvements. "However," she continued, "it's important to recognize that these results were made possible by the corporate transformation initiative my office introduced earlier this year." She clicked to another slide. It showed my performance charts, my process diagrams, even the workflow graphics Emma had designed. Only now the title read, "Corporate Transformation Success Story." No mention of operations. No mention of my department. No mention of the team that had spent weekends testing every change. I looked at Emma across the room. Her eyes widened. She hadn't seen these slides before either. One board member asked, "So your office designed the implementation?" Melissa answered without hesitation. "Yes. My team developed the strategic framework. Operations executed according to our recommendations." That wasn't just misleading. It was false. Richard turned toward me. Anything you'd like to add? There it was. My opportunity. Every instinct told me to expose what had just happened. Instead, I chose restraint. Only one clarification. Melissa looked directly at me. Our department completed the first pilot 14 months before the transformation office was created. A few heads turned. I continued calmly. The documentation, testing records, and approval reports are all archived if anyone wishes to review them. Nobody spoke. Melissa smiled politely. I'm sure several departments contributed over time. She had found the perfect corporate answer. Vague enough to avoid lying. Specific enough to erase responsibility. Richard cleared his throat. Thank you, everyone. Let's move to the next agenda item. Just like that. 17 years of credibility had been reduced to a footnote. Emma followed me back to my office. Did that really just happen? It did. She stole the entire project. Not exactly. Emma frowned. What do you mean, not exactly? She didn't steal the work. I sat down. She stole the story. She looked confused. The work still exists. The reports exist. The emails exist. But whoever controls the story usually controls the credit. Emma shook her head. So what do we do? For now. I open my laptop. We document everything. Over the next month I became unusually careful. Every meeting ended with written summaries. Every approval was confirmed by email. Every version of every report was archived. Emma joked that we were creating enough paperwork to fill another warehouse. Maybe we were. I didn't care. Experience had taught me something years earlier. Facts disappear surprisingly fast when nobody preserves them. Meanwhile, Melissa's influence kept growing. She attended meetings that had nothing to do with operations. She began speaking directly with board members instead of department heads. Richard trusted her completely. Whenever she suggested another restructuring plan, he approved it. Then came the first real warning. Kevin Foster, Vice President of Human Resources, stopped by my office late Friday afternoon. He closed the door behind him. You have a minute? Sure. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he looked through the window toward the warehouse floor. I probably shouldn't be saying this. Then why are you here? Because I respect what you've built. Finally, he sat down. Melissa asked HR to prepare several organizational scenarios. What kind of scenarios? He hesitated. Department consolidations. I already knew what that meant. My position? Kevin nodded slowly. It's one possibility. Based on what? Officially. He forced a weak smile. Operational efficiency. And unofficially? Visibility. I leaned back. I don't follow. She believes too many company successes are associated with your department instead of executive leadership. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. So the solution is to remove the department? Kevin didn't answer. He didn't need to. Silence confirmed everything. Before leaving, he said something I wouldn't forget. Daniel. Yes. If I were you. He paused. I'd make copies of everything. That weekend I stayed in the office alone. The warehouse was quiet. No meetings. No presentations. No politics. Just shelves stretching across hundreds of thousands of square feet. I walked every aisle. Talked to the night supervisors. Watched trucks leave the loading docks. This place had become part of my life. I wasn't afraid of losing a title. Titles come and go. I was afraid of watching years of honest work disappear because someone higher up decided history should look different. As I locked my office Sunday evening, I noticed a notification on my phone. Executive Leadership Dinner, Thursday evening. Attendance mandatory. Special guest. The company's largest client. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Corporate dinners usually celebrated success. Something told me this one wouldn't. And for the first time in 17 years, I walked into a new week feeling that my career wasn't being measured anymore. It was being quietly dismantled. The executive dinner was held at the Grand Oak Club, a private venue our company reserved for its largest clients. I had attended dozens of similar dinners over the years. Usually they were predictable. A few speeches, a presentation, dinner. some networking. Everyone went home satisfied. This one felt different before it even started. Melissa was greeting guests at the entrance as though she had been hosting these events for years. Richard introduced her to everyone personally. Our transformation leader. Our strategic visionary. Our future. I smiled politely every time our eyes met. Inside, I kept noticing small details. The presentation folders on every table carried Melissa's department logo, not the company's. The printed agenda listed her keynote before mine. That had never happened before. The guest of honor was Michael Donovan, CEO of Atlas Retail Group. Atlas accounted for nearly 20% of our annual revenue. For 17 years, I had worked directly with his operations team. Whenever a warehouse problem appeared, they called me. Not because it was written into the contract. Because they trusted me. Michael shook my hand. Daniel. Good to see you. Likewise. He smiled. I've heard you've been making some impressive improvements. Before I could answer, Melissa stepped beside us. It's been a company-wide effort. Michael nodded politely. I'm looking forward to hearing more. Dinner passed without incident. Then Richard stood. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Melissa Carter, who will share the story behind Horizon's operational transformation. I wasn't expecting that. According to the original agenda, I was supposed to present first. Melissa walked confidently to the stage. For nearly 20 minutes she explained how executive leadership had redesigned warehouse operations. Slide after slide looked painfully familiar. The process maps, the scheduling system, the forecasting model, even the implementation timeline. Everything came from projects my team had completed. The only thing missing was any mention of my department. Several people applauded enthusiastically. Richard smiled with obvious pride. Then he looked toward me. Daniel will now explain how operations executed Melissa's strategy. For a brief second, the room disappeared. I simply stared at him. Executed her strategy? That wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. That was the official company narrative. I walked onto the stage anyway. Professionals don't lose control in front of clients. I connected my laptop. Instead of opening my prepared presentation, I opened something else. A timeline. Nothing dramatic. Just dates. Project approvals. Implementation records. Emails confirming executive authorization. Every document carried timestamps. Every milestone predated Melissa's arrival by months. I thought I'd begin with a little history, I said calmly. The room became noticeably quieter. This scheduling model entered pilot testing 16 months before our transformation office existed. Next slide. Our inventory forecasting software was approved 11 months before Melissa joined Horizon. Next slide. The warehouse redesign was completed 8 months before the first transformation committee meeting. No accusations. No emotional speeches. Only facts. Michael Donovan leaned forward. Several board members exchanged nervous looks. Melissa remained perfectly still. When I finished, I simply said, "Successful operations are never created by one executive. They're built by hundreds of employees whose work deserves to be recognized." Silence. Then Michael began applauding. Slowly, others joined him. Richard thanked everyone and quickly announced dessert. The evening ended earlier than expected. As guests began leaving, Michael approached me near the lobby. "Walk with me." Outside, the parking lot was almost empty. He stopped beside his car. "I've worked with you for nearly 2 decades. I appreciate that. You've never exaggerated your accomplishments. I've never had a reason to." He nodded. "That's why tonight bothered me." I stayed quiet. When executives compete for recognition instead of solving problems, clients notice. He looked directly at me. "If things change here." He paused. "Give me a call before you accept another position." I smiled. I wasn't planning to leave. "You may not get that choice." Those words stayed with me the entire drive home. Monday morning confirmed his prediction. My access to 3 executive systems had been removed. No explanation. Several recurring meetings disappeared from my calendar. Emma walked into my office carrying a printed email. "You need to see this." The message announced another organizational restructuring. Effective immediately, The operations department would report directly to Melissa Carter. My authority over budgeting had been suspended. Hiring approvals were transferred. Strategic planning was reassigned. On paper, I was still director of operations. In reality, most of my responsibilities had quietly vanished. Emma sat across from my desk. They're stripping your position. I know. What are you going to do? I looked at the warehouse through my office window. Forklifts moved between loading docks. Employees continued doing their jobs. None of them knew what was happening upstairs. They're waiting for me to lose my temper, I said. Emma nodded. So don't. I won't. What then? I opened a cabinet beside my desk. Inside were dozens of project binders, performance reports, approval documents, meeting minutes, development records, 17 years of history. I keep working. Emma looked surprised. That's it? No. I closed the cabinet. I also make sure the truth survives. 3 days later, Kevin from Human Resources called me. His voice sounded unusually serious. Daniel, can you stop by my office? Sure. When I arrived, he closed the blinds before speaking. I shouldn't even be having this conversation. What happened? He slid a folder across the desk. I found this during an approval review. Inside was a document titled Leadership Transition Plan. Halfway down the page, I found my name. Position to be eliminated during Phase 2 restructuring. Target completion. 30 days. I slowly closed the folder. So, I said quietly, they've already decided. Kevin nodded. I'm sorry. For the first time since all of this started, I realized something important. This was never about improving the company. The decision had already been made. Everything happening now was simply creating a story that would justify it. I wasn't surprised when the invitation arrived. Meeting with Human Resources. Tuesday, 10 a.m. No agenda. No explanation. Just a calendar notification. After 17 years in management, I knew exactly what those meetings usually meant. Still, I slept surprisingly well the night before. Not because I expected good news. Because uncertainty was finally coming to an end. Kevin from HR looked exhausted when I entered the conference room. Melissa was already there. Richard arrived a minute later carrying a thin folder. That folder told me everything. When companies terminate employees, they rarely need thick folders. The decision has already been made. The paperwork is simply a formality. Richard cleared his throat. Daniel, this isn't an easy conversation. They never are. He nodded. As part of our organizational restructuring, we've decided to eliminate the Director of Operations position. Melissa remained completely silent. Richard continued. This decision isn't related to your performance. I almost smiled. Corporate language always sounds the same. Asterisk, it's not about performance. Asterisk. Asterisk, it's about restructuring. Asterisk. Asterisk, nothing personal. Asterisk. Yet somehow the restructuring always removes the same people. When does the change become effective? I asked. Immediately. And my team? They'll report directly to Melissa. Exactly as planned. Kevin slid the separation package across the table. For month's salary. Continuation of benefits. A standard confidentiality agreement. I skimmed through the pages. Then I signed. Melissa finally spoke. I hope you understand this decision. I do. She seemed surprised. I understand that every executive has the right to build their own leadership team. Neither Richard nor Melissa expected that answer. I stood up. I have one request. Richard nodded. Go ahead. I'd like to say goodbye to my team. He looked at Melissa. She hesitated before answering. 15 minutes. That's all I need. Walking through the warehouse one last time was harder than I expected. News travels quickly inside any company. By the time I reached my department, everyone already knew. Nobody said much. Some shook my hand. Others simply nodded. Emma waited until everyone else had left. This isn't fair. No. What are you going to do? I looked around my office. The shelves were almost empty. I'd packed most of my personal things over the weekend. I'll find another job. You make it sound easy. It won't be. I smiled. But I've solved harder problems than unemployment. She laughed quietly. I was hoping you'd say something dramatic. Like what? I don't know. They'll regret this. I picked up the last box from my desk. They might. I paused. But if they do, it should be because they made a bad business decision. Not because I spend the next year trying to get revenge. My phone rang before I even reached home. Michael Donovan. Daniel. Hi, Michael. I heard. I figured you would. I have a question. I'm listening. If you aren't committed somewhere else. He paused. Would you consider meeting with our executive team? I frowned. For a job? Not exactly. What then? We're reviewing every logistics partner we work with. I stayed silent. We also advise several companies that are struggling with operational performance. He continued. After what I saw last week, I think your experience could help more than one organization. It wasn't an offer. Not yet. It was simply a conversation. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't expected. Curiosity. 2 weeks later, I walked into Atlas Retail Group's headquarters. There were no promises, no contracts, just a discussion. Michael introduced me to 4 senior executives. Instead of asking why I'd left Horizon, they asked something completely different. If you could rebuild a logistics operation from scratch, what would you change first? For nearly 2 hours we talked about leadership, warehouse efficiency, employee retention, forecasting, technology. Nobody asked about office politics. Nobody cared who received credit. They only cared whether ideas worked. When the meeting ended, Michael walked me to the elevator. You know what impressed everyone today? What? You answered every question with examples. He smiled. You never once criticized your former employer. I don't see the point. Neither do we. The elevator doors opened. We'll be in touch. 3 days later, Atlas offered me a 6-month consulting contract. The compensation was slightly lower than my previous executive salary. I accepted anyway. Not because of the money, because it gave me something far more valuable. A chance to prove that my success had never depended on one company. Within 2 months, I was helping 3 different organizations improve warehouse operations. Word spread faster than I expected. Most recommendations came from former clients. Not recruiters. Not executives. People who had actually worked with me. That meant more than any title ever could. One Friday afternoon, Emma called. You'll never guess. What happened? Horizon just lost the Atlas contract. I wasn't surprised. They're putting it out for competitive review. She lowered her voice. People are starting to ask questions. What kind of questions? Questions about why every successful project suddenly stopped after you left. I looked out the window of my temporary office. Snow had begun falling across the parking lot. Sometimes consequences arrive immediately. Sometimes they take months. But eventually performance becomes impossible to fake. Looking back, losing my job wasn't the worst day of my career. It only felt that way at the time. The worst thing would have been staying somewhere that valued politics more than results. 17 years taught me how to build efficient operations. Getting fired taught me something even more important. Your reputation doesn't belong to the company that employs you. It belongs to the people who have seen your work with their own eyes. Titles can disappear overnight. Departments can be reorganized. Organizational charts can be rewritten. But competence has a habit of finding new opportunities. And once people trust your work, that becomes something no executive can quietly take away.